So, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the Dimension Fold YouTube channel and podcast. Today we have with us special guest David Collis, author of the book Interviewing Jesus the Man, which we have already talked about on a previous episode, so you'll want to check that out. I can't. I should actually tell you which episode it is, but I can't remember right now. And but yeah, it says David Collis on it. So today we are not going to talk about David's book, but instead David has some other interesting items to share with us. And I haven't really got too much information on that so far. So David, let's enlighten us. What is the interesting stuff you want to talk about today?
So, you asked me if I wanted to come back on the show and discuss some of the mystical experiences that I have had, and there have
Mhm.
been numerous ones. And so I really had to stop and think about that for a minute and whether or not I wanted to even talk about them because I'm so private about this stuff because some of them are so wild and bizarre that it kind of opens up a can of worms. So I
Yeah,
I stopped and thought about that for a little bit, and my wife says, "Well, why don't you just go ahead and do it anyway, and then just see what happens?" So I thought,
yeah,
okay. So I agreed with that, and
yes.
then I thought, okay, so if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to kind of put on my like cataloging mind and really start thinking about this stuff because they go all the way back to the time that I was 4 years old, and now I'm older and I have all this stuff. So I thought, how am I going to like condense all this material into just a you know um, an hour show? And I just figured that there's going to be some highlights. I'm going to have to talk about certain things and probably not touch upon some other things, and that's kind of what I decided that I'm going to have to do.
Okay.
So I
So, well, I mean, luckily you are here among friends and we all love the weird shit. So we're ready for it.
okay.
And also don't worry about your other conservative friends and family seeing it because unless you share it with them, they're probably not going to ever find it. So so it's all good. Um so are we talking about like paranormal or spiritual or UFOs or all of the above?
Well, let's just say that I have a lot of different types of encounters. They're both mystical and they're religious and spiritual and they're supernatural. So one of the things that I thought about is like, as I was doing this whole kind of project to think through all of this, I remember an old adage and it says, if you ever want to know how far you've gone, just stop and look back. And
Hmm.
that's what I did with this. And I went, holy cow, there is so much material. So one of the most important of the experiences that I have, and that is my dreams. And I have been having dreams since I've been 4 years old. And as you know from the Old Testament, dreams are messages from the gods, and they let you know either what's about to happen or what you need to do. And I spent 3 years with a Jungian analyst analyzing my dreams and trying to understand dream symbolism, and I kind of got a good handle on it. But I thought I would go ahead and read a couple of these dreams to you. I figured that each one of these kind of experiences, I'll just go ahead and kind of give you kind of a brief cliff note kind of idea. So, I mean,
Yeah.
instead of going through lots and lots of dreams, I figured I would choose three because they're pretty juicy and they're pretty exciting.
Okay, cool.
Um,
So you're using like a Jungian analytical approach to dream interpretation and symbology?
uh, yeah, well, I went to a Jungian analyst and I spent
Yeah.
3 years with them. Okay, before I
Okay,
get
good.
started, I was thinking about, okay, well, what is a mystical experience and what is a supernatural experience? And I decided to go to the dictionary and get Webster's dictionary. And Webster's defines mystical is having a spiritual meaning or reality that is neither apparent to the senses nor obvious to the intelligence.
Mm.
Also of, relating to, or resulting from an individual's direct communion with God or supreme reality. So that's mystical. And then supernatural is defined as of or relating to an order of existence beyond the visible, observable universe, of or relating to God or a god, demigod, spirit, or devil. And then there's also another part to that, departing from what is usual or normal, especially as to appear to transcend the laws of nature. So those were the definitions that Webster's gives. And I'm going to go back to a dream that I had when I was 4 years old. And I just kind of want to mention that part of my experience here on this plane has been that I've always had some sense of the divine. There's always been some sense of God. And I've always had an interest in kind of supernatural and mystical subjects. So when I was a young boy and as a teenager, I was very fascinated by the Bermuda Triangle, chariots of the god. I had a fascination with megalithic structures. And I had my own interest in creative visualization. So I found myself being completely attuned to having a lot of visual information come to me in the forms of, dreams or other kind of visions. So I know that some people have a heightened sense of awareness, whether it's hearing or smelling or taste, but mine seems to be visual. So a lot of things come to me from a visual point of view. So here is the first dream that I had, and I'm going to say this is the most earliest of the dreams I've ever had, and I believe that I was 4 years old at the time. And so I'm going to read it. In the dream, I was an old man with long white hair and a long white beard, and I was riding in the back of a white horse through a very surreal and unknown landscape. The ground pulsated and coursed with a light energy of which I've never seen before. In my hand, I held 3 softball-sized crystal orbs in my hand. And I was kind of like holding them like this, and there were these 3 spheres in them. And they were like crystal spheres. You can kind of see through them. And I had to make a choice to enter one of these spheres. And
to enter it.
I had to enter one of those spheres. So here's a sphere, I'm holding in my hand. There's 3 of them. And they're about the size of a softball. And in it, I had to choose which one to go into. And so I made a choice. And at that point, I dematerialized and I kind of became particles, and I entered into the sphere, into one of the spheres. And once I did, I was at the furthest edge of the universe. And the journey was to go through the entire universe, to our solar system, through all of our planets, and then land on planet Earth, where I became incarnated as a human. Wow. So that was my first dream as a 4-year-old.
Yeah, that almost sounds like it's like there's 3 different universes and you can choose which one you want to be born into.
And then there's another universe I was in when I was riding on the 4th horse, or when I was riding on the horse. So here are 3 spheres, 3 universes, 3 multi-dimensional kind of experiences, and there's still another reality behind that.
Yeah.
So that was the first one. And the next one I'm going to read is a dream that I had sometime in my late 30s. It was also a very visionary dreams, and we can kind of talk a little bit about the nature of dreams. But anyway, this too was a visionary dream, and in this dream, I was walking on top of the ocean, moving through the surf as I was walking on top of the water. And I was astonished that I was walking on the water. And then I realized what I was doing is that I was creating a reverse polarity between my energy field and the energy field of the water. And I was able to reverse the magnetic pulse of my body so that it would be rejected by the water. And that is how I walked on water.
Right.
So this was like giving me an insight into another way in which our universe can be experienced, and that is somehow inside ourselves is the ability to act in a way and act in accordance to other like electromagnetic realities. So
Right.
instead of just accepting the one that we have right now, I think, we have the ability to change the ones that we have, and that what we can do with that. So, and then the most recent one that I had that I'm going to read or discuss is the dream that I had when just a few days ago, well, maybe a couple of weeks ago. And a lot of the dreams, there might be visionary types of dreams, visual, but there's also other feelings that are associated with this. But in this particular dream, this is kind of giving me a sense of what's going on in my life at the moment. And just kind of as a backstory, the last 4 or 5 years have been really strenuous and difficult and challenging. And I have been, just kind of having to face one thing after another, after another, after another. And it just kind of got to me. And so finally, I think this dream was telling me what was going on.
Mm.
And in it, I was walking through a scorched forest, and there was nothing green in the area. Everything was burnt to a crisp. So we have the chocolate brown soil that have been burnt, and we have the dark and charred tree stumps. And as I was walking through this forest, there was a voice that said to me, it was necessary for you to have this experience, meaning the last 4 years of my life, so that an entirely new life can come about. And then I realized that this is a phoenix experience where, everything gets destroyed, and then this whole new bird, the whole new life comes in and into existence. And I kind of think that that's what's happening. I just feel like what happened is now, I wouldn't say is completely over, but I feel like I'm totally out of that storm and I'm heading in a new direction.
Right.
So, dreams are very, very important for me. I do not like taking medicine because it interferes with my dreams. I don't like drinking alcohol because it also disrupts my dreams. And I just feel that the more I'm connected to my dreams, the more I'm connected to myself. And so it's really important for me to not interfere with any of those processes. And that's what I found for myself. I mean, part of all these experiences that I've had also have to do with just understanding who I am and how all of this information, what am I going to do with all this information? And so dreams were one of the first things I decided that I wanted to really engage in and try to understand and interpret. So I pay attention to those. In fact, the other night that we had some people over, and one of the guests said, "Oh, I just had this dream," and she explained the dream to me, and I kind of thought, "Oh, I wonder if I should say anything to her because I know what this dream is telling her."
Yeah.
So I did. And it was a complete insight for her. Again, it's symbolism, but if you can read the symbols, you can kind of understand and access, this level of information. And of course, with dreams, you have the key to understanding what's going on in somebody's life and what they're dealing with. So dreams have been part of my kind of mystical experience. I have them on a regular basis. I dream every day. I know I remember a lot. I don't remember all of them, but I know I'm having them.
Yeah.
So that was I kind of I look at dreams as part of a mystical experience, and that's been with me for quite some time. But those are not the only type of experiences that I have. There are a
So
lot more.
before we leave the dream arena for a second, so do you think that your other are your other experiences going to tie back into this dream stuff, or is now a good time to try to deal with just the dreams themselves?
Well, I think that some of these things run parallel to each other, and some of them kind of weave through each other.
Right.
And I think the dream has its own course, its own track, and it seems to always be riding along that.
Yeah.
So regardless of what else is happening in my life, that's always going on. The other things are very fascinating. And so I'm really kind of happy that I was able to kind of go through this exercise to look at this stuff, because I'm now looking at it from a new vantage point, and I'm seeing that there are connections that are occurring and that things are not necessarily reoccurring, but there are things that weave in and out and that they are grouped together based off of whatever information a particular experience is going to provide. So,
Yeah.
and I'll get to some of this, but what I found is that when something comes to me, it comes to me in a way that, it's like Paul. You just get knocked off your horse, you're blinded for a bit, and blinded, I mean, he was physically blinded, but there's also kind of other metaphors about that. You're just knocked off your horse and you really can't function anymore.
Right.
So I've had those types of experiences. And so what I have found is that some of these experiences really kind of change and redirect and refocus your life and what you and where you're going to go. And
Yeah.
so there was one instance in one particular experience that I had when I was 19, in which I noticed after doing this all this work and cataloging it all, is that was the moment when a lot of things opened up for me. But I had to go through kind of hell first to kind of get through that. And then after that, all this other stuff started to flow. And each one of those had its own information. And that information has lasted for years and years and years, if decades.
Right.
So what I found is that, one thing gets started and then another thing, gets started and then another thing gets started. It's a little bit like musical choruses where, row, row, row your boat, and then you get the next line and then the
Yeah.
next,
Yeah.
and it kind of goes through that. And so there's beginnings and ends to these experiences, but inside the experience, there's just a whole new way, a new life, a new understanding of what I have to experience. Okay.
Right.
So when I was 19, I had this experience, and it was a really terrible and horrific experience. And it was what I refer to it as the existential crisis in my life. So um, I had I had left home to go to school in another state. That didn't work out for me. I came back, and now I'm kind of at this crisis of wondering, what am I going to do with my life? Where am I going to go? And all that. And all these things just, this kind of the emotional cauldron just started, spinning and turning and really kind of boiled over and it kind of exploded. And so when I was 19 in the dead of winter, I had this experience. And in the experience, it was um, a complete existential despair. It was the complete insight that, life was meaningless and that there was nothingness. And so there was no point of me even to move on. And at 19, when you're kind of leaving your teenage
Mhm.
years and you're going into your adult life, I mean, I think that the last thing you want is, what's the point? Right. And so that was what I ended up having. And the vision that kept coming to me was this a train set, right? And so the train just kept spinning around on its track and it kept on spinning around and around and around and around. And I went, no matter what you do, you're going to die. No matter, you can go fast, you can go slow, you can explore this or you can explore that. It doesn't matter. In the end, you're going to die. And there's no point to it. Everything is meaningless. Okay. Well, that devastated, that whole concept just really threw me for a loop. And it had long-term consequences. And then I became suicidal because of it. And fortunately, I didn't commit the act, but the emotions were really raw. The emotions were very sensitive. And it set me down on this path to seek wisdom. So along the way, I decided it was so unbearable. I thought, I'm not feeling good about this. And I feel like the best thing to do is just kind of go ahead and end this. But I did it. And I decided, for whatever reason, there was a little voice in my head that said, just know that there's a lot more out there that you can learn and seek wisdom. So I decided that that was what I was going to do. And from that moment on, I have kind of dedicated myself to seeking wisdom. And I have the equivalent I'm just kind of looking at my libraries because I got two libraries, and the library I'm in front of right now is 22 feet long, and there's one, two, three, there are four shelves with books. I have another one upstairs that has six shelves, and it has they're 16 feet each shelf, six, so I have essentially the equivalent of 10 or 15 stories of books. They're just huge. And that is all part of this quest that I was on to seek knowledge. And so I just kind of put my nose to the grindstone and just read everything.
Right.
And I did as much as I could. So with that, that seems to be the groundwork that started this whole ball rolling. So I went from, the childhood experiences to this really aggressive experience. And now I'm going to start entering into the next phase of my mystical experiences. And this one also, there were visions to it, there were experiences to it, and this also lasted for years. So I call this is my Jesus experience. So this is a little bit of my road to Damascus experience. I grew up at the beach, and one of the things that I was doing at this particular time was riding my bike, for 10, 15 miles, and then coming back, and so at night. And so at this particular night, I had finished my ride, and I then got off my bike and I started pushing my bike up this very steep hill. And as I got to the very top of this hill, I noticed that there was, of course, it's 11 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock at night. So, I mean, here it is. It's dark. There's no one out. Everything is quiet. People were sleeping. There's hardly any cars out. There's no one walking around. And at the end of the block, I see this man standing underneath this lamp post, and the light was shining on it. And I looked at him and I went, God, how interesting. The guy's dressed in a robe. How bizarre is that?
Oh.
I pushed my bike a little further, and then I realized that the person on the other side, this is the person that was on the other side of the street, down at the other end of the block. I realized that that person was Jesus. So in my mind, I said, hey, don't go, because I can see him turning around and walking in the opposite direction from me. So I thought, don't go. Well, with that, he turned around and he crosses the street and he starts walking to me. So we eventually met, and we just looked at each other. Now, this is a real person.
Yeah.
So we just looked at each other. We didn't say a word. So I just said, oh, I'm walking my bike. So he and I walked side by side. We went down the street. We went up to one of the streets, made a right-hand turn, walked down this street for about 3 or 4 or 5 blocks. And then I finally got to the street that I needed to make a left-hand turn on. And once I made this left-hand turn, there was another light post, a street light, at the very end of the block, which was about 200 yards away. And this light was shining this blade of light that was so bright and so huge. And it was just this blade of light was coming right into my eye. And I thought, wow. And so I noticed that Jesus was rising up from the ground, and he got on top of this light, and like an escalator, he was just cruising right into the light, but the light was another 200 or 300 yards or 200 yards away. And I said, hey, wait a minute. Don't go. Don't leave me. And he turns around and he says, I never have. And so he got to the very end of the blade. Well, I was at one end of the blade, and it was at the other end of the light, and then he disappeared. So I went back and I timed how long that took. That was from the time that I saw him to the time that we met, from the time that we then walked down to the time that he left, into the other light, 10 minutes went by. So for 10 minutes, I was with Jesus. It wasn't even like a vision. It was just almost like a literal man walking to me. So one of my favorite stories in the New Testament is the road to Emmaus, because, there is, Jesus, I already knew who he was. He didn't have to appear.
Right.
So that was the first Jesus experience that I had. And then I had two subsequent ones after that within 2 weeks. So the second one, I was on the bus and I was I was always taking the bus to my college. And so I was on the bus and I was getting near the point where I had to exit the bus. And here on the bus, I'm looking at, there's Jesus again, and he's, on the whipping post and he's being beaten, and there's blood everywhere, and he had the crown of thorns on. And I went, "Whoa, what's this?" I was really kind of stunned by that. So I get off
Okay,
the
so wait a second. So you're on the bus and you looked out the window and you saw that?
I'm on the bus and I can see Jesus in the aisle, but it's
Oh,
all of a sudden it's like I'm being transported to that space back in the first century where Jesus was beaten, and I can see this happening to him.
okay.
So the bus stops and I have to get off, and I thought, oh my God, this is bizarre. So I got off the bus and I said, God, you won't believe the experience I just had. Well, what happened? And I told her what happened, and she just went, oh my. So that was the second vision of Jesus that I had. And then the last vision of Jesus that I had, I was at my house and I was reading the book, and I had just opened up the front cover, and lo and behold, I get transported out into this desert. And every color, so it's like the sun is going down, so it's a kind of a twilight experience with
Mhm.
all the colors of the desert, which is blues and purples and reds and orange, and they're all pastel, very deep, dark pastel colors with this beautiful kind of ambient dark light.
Mhm.
And I was sticking my hands in the river to drink the water from it. And I realized, hey, there's this presence behind me. So I'm on my hands and knees, water into my mouth and drinking water. And I turn around and there's Jesus, and he's in his white robe, brilliant white light, and he's holding his hands out and he says, come with me. I want to take you to the Father. So I get up and I walk over to him, and he has his hands out to me, and I touch one of his hands. And the next thing you know, we are just zooming off into outer space.
Whoa. Like you could actually like experience like the
Yes,
flight?
yes.
Wow.
So
Wow.
with that, then so with that, the vision ended.
Mm.
And from there, uh, that started my Christian experience, and that lasted, a long time. So during this period, I started speaking in tongues. I had this supernatural kind of experience where I just felt an enormous amount of love. I felt like I just kept reading the New Testament over and over and over again. Then I started reading the Old Testament. And the funny thing is that as I was reading the Old Testament, I got this overwhelming sense that I knew all of this, even though I'd never read any of it. I just knew it. And
Mm.
I knew what was happening, about to happen. It was like around the corner. So even before I was going to get to that corner, I knew what was going to happen anyway. And so there was
Okay.
this real strong presence that there was something important about that. And then the other thing that was coming through was that history seems to already have a course of action to it. It seems to be flowing in a particular direction. And that, here is Jesus, here's the Old Testament, here's God, and it's all kind of laid out as a plan of action. I went, wow.
Yeah.
So I ended up, really studying theology. I ended up going to church. I ended up being baptized. And then I started to share some of my visionary experiences with people, and they didn't like any of it. They did not, do not say
How did
anything.
I know you were going to say that?
Do not talk about this stuff. And I thought, how fascinating, because if you look at the New Testament and you look at the Old Testament, mystical experiences are happening all the time.
Yeah.
And yet now, when I have my own experiences, it was considered wrong.
Not
Not,
cool.
it wasn't cool, right? Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
again, when I'm so now after I'm on the bus and I'm going home from college, I would be reading the New Testament, And on two occasions, I, and this is again, this is now I'm going to start kind of talking about how certain patterns with my experiences start not, there's certain things within each of these visions that things seem to repeat themselves. And it
Mm.
might not be the information, and not be might be the content, it's not like the, you know, what it is that I've seen, but there are other patterns that are underneath all this. And so I'm on the bus and I'm reading the book of Revelation, and I get to the Revelation 2:17, and in it it says, I will also give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. And with that, after reading that, I pass out. And then when I finally wake, I'm only 2 blocks away or 2 stops away from where I have to get off. So I wake up and I kind of get myself ready to get off the bus, and I put my hand in my pocket, and lo and behold, I pull out a white rock.
What?
This rock was in my pocket and I didn't even put it there, but it was put
Yeah.
there during the time that I was asleep. So
Right.
this idea of like certain things are about to happen, it's almost like it's so potent that I can't experience it being fully awake, so I get put to sleep. And that seems to happen fairly regularly, is when these things come to me, I get into a kind of a trance-like thing, and some of them I just pass out, and then either something happens while I'm passed out, or something um, when I wake up, then something
Yeah.
happens. Okay, so it seems that sleep is part of this.
Huh.
So anyway, that was the White Rock. That happened twice, twice. And part of all of these types of experiences were so new to me. I didn't understand what to make of this or what to believe in it. My family didn't want to, you know, they couldn't deal with the fact that I had this existential crisis and I was in a state of crisis. And now I'm starting to have all these visions. So not only was my family ill-equipped to manage this, my society wasn't, you know, able to manage any of this. So I started to
Right.
realize I'm on my own, you know. So
Yeah.
this is
So
going to be
can I make
tough
an
stuff.
observation for a second? So
Sure.
it seems to me that like there is some parallelism here in that all of these things that are happening, whether they're dreams or other experiences, or like who knows what the hell that was, they all seem to be kind of focusing on accomplishing the same type of task, and that is to give you a direct, like to give you spiritual direction in whatever way, whether those messages may be different, like because
That's
some
correct.
of them seem like, oh well, like the three spheres thing is almost like a reincarnation kind of a vibe. Whereas then you talk about, you know, kind of the destiny and stuff like that. But really, in all of those, it's something is happening to give you direction through this crazy world or life that we are in.
That's right.
And yeah, so that's fascinating. And I
Yes,
mean, there's there's probably all kinds of observations or and analysis that people could interpret their different ways, like in terms of, is it your subconscious speaking to you? Is it a higher power? Is it God? Is it who knows what it is? Like, but I mean, I don't think we have enough information to even scratch the surface of that. But it is interesting that somebody, whether it's you or someone else, is clarifying your kind of your life mission in a way.
uh, I agree with that. And see, at the time, I didn't understand this, but you know, as I start looking back, going, hey, there seems to be some reoccurring patterns here, and all of them is information is impacted within certain events, and those events are now going to play themselves out. It's I kind of look at it, since I grew up at the beach and I surfed, I look at it as a wave coming through, and then it crashes, and then it just keeps moving towards the shoreline, and eventually it ends up at the shore and it kind of dies. But from the time it crashes to the time that it gets to the shoreline, there's all this churning, right? So
Yeah,
even
I
though
resonate with that very strongly, and that's through a dream thing that happened to me because I grew up in the Vancouver area where we're near the ocean, but there's no surfing waves to speak of because of the islands are blocking them, and plus it's pretty dang cold out there. So I never surfed, but through a many year period, I would have dreams where I was surfing. And it
wow,
was so real that I became convinced that in a previous life I had been a surfer. Even though I don't believe in previous lives, uh, it's just that real. Like, that's the only thing I could conclude. So, yeah, I mean, it's weird, isn't it?
I'm telling you, I've it's taken a long time for me to sort through and absorb and digest all this material and all the strange things happen. And these are the things that started to happen to me. And this was like the beginning of the episodes.
Hmm,
This wasn't the first one or the second one, and then that was it. No, this was the start, and now there's all this other stuff that's about to come. But I didn't know that at the time, but I do now.
right.
But anyway, kind of going back through, so with Christianity, um, I ended up speaking in tongues. I was baptized. I went to church, and I just started to learn almost as many facets of Christianity as I possibly could. So I was really interested in its history. I was interested in um, the early Christian movement, and at the time of Jesus, the first century, I was really interested in the theology. I then started getting very fascinated by the mystical side of Christianity, which
Right.
is Saint John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. And I ended up reading, the Imitation of Christ and the Pseudo Dionysius. And there's all this great, great information out there that is all part of Christianity that really is not looked upon very well. And it's really kind of not accepted. So it takes, somebody to really kind of understand the true meaning of it and not to get too scared of it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
that's kind of the thing, right? It's like people aren't really open to hearing your kinds of experience either, nor are they interested in reading a lot of this material because some of it's weird, and it's like we're okay. It's all well and fine to read the Bible, but the Bible has some really weird stuff in it too, and we kind of just either don't talk about those things or we interpret them in a very rational very mentalist kind of approach where it's like, well, yeah, but it was, we can explain it away somehow.
yep.
Yeah, which I think is really shameful because when you look at the ministry of Jesus, like in terms of what Jesus actually did when he was on this earth, what was he mostly doing was mostly healing people, which we can't explain, and very few of us have even tried to do.
Yep.
But I know it's possible because I've tried it and it worked. So what the heck is going on?
Right.
And there's this vast divide between God as a concept or as a being, and then this tiny little box that we try to shove him into on Sunday morning.
Right.
So it just doesn't jive, and
No.
there's something strange going on here.
Yeah. Well, historically, it what you're talking about is the emphasis on scripture and literature, which is Catholicism, which then became Protestantism, versus the kind of the Greek Orthodox or the Near East, which is more mystical. And then even
Hmm.
when you get down into Alexandria, where there was the Coptic church down there, there's another form of mysticism. And those two versions, which is part of the Eastern Mediterranean, they were interested in the literature, but it was more important to have these kind of mystical experiences. I think Quakerism is probably the closest that we would have that would be associated with that. Being silent and allowing the Holy Spirit to kind of move you.
Right.
Uh, so let me just kind of finish up with the stuff with Christianity because there's other things because this is like its own like encyclopedia of information.
Okay.
And so I learned, the mystics, early Christianity, the history of Christianity, the mysticism of Christianity, and then part of the last leg of the interest of Christianity was Gnosticism. And with that, I ended up presenting a 4-part lecture series on the Gospel of Thomas to explain those very esoteric sayings of Jesus. And that also is kind of relays a little bit to, or parlays into some of the things that you were just mentioning in sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. They are very esoteric. And I equate that to um, trying to understand calculus without even understanding, your basic multiplications. And once I realized that this is a form of spiritual calculus, what are the Gospels? They're just talking about stories, and it's more about the heart than it is about the mind. And so the Gnostics, particularly the Gospel of Thomas, has a very mind-orientated direction and thrust towards the divine. And those are also Jesus's words. But the Gospels have more to do with the stories of who Jesus was and the heart, how you're compassionate. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just, have you read much of the Kabbalistic kind of stuff at all?
Yeah.
Do you find that are there any parallels there between the Kabbalah and the Gnostic kind of writings or thought processes?
There are differences, and part of them have to do with what I found is that the Gospel of Thomas and some of those early versions of this material that you found in the Nag Hammadi library have Eastern influences. So Hinduism in there quite a bit.
Yeah.
And there's the other thing about Christianity is that since it was part of the Greco-Roman Empire, we're going to start seeing the influences of the metaphysical ideas that the Greeks and the Romans had. And so they kind of blended that together, of course, with the Egyptian religion. So, Christianity is kind of amalgamation. And this happened to be at the time, part of the Roman Empire was, hey, there's this part over here and there's this part over here. What happens when we bolt these things together? What do we get?
Yeah, well, exactly. And see, this is a thing that really I find quite fascinating, because the kind of the conservative view within Christianity is that all of these theological concepts that we like to talk about, for example, the afterlife as a simple one. Well, there's this idea that that Jesus invented that, and so Jesus came and said, "Hey, I'm going to believe in me and I'll take you to heaven." Well, okay, he didn't really even say that, for one thing, but also Jesus totally did not invent that, because it's if anybody was into the afterlife, it's the Egyptians. And Egypt was a huge influence on the Greek and Roman empires. And literally you could almost say that Christianity is really just a splinter group cult of the ancient Egyptian religion. It has more to do with that than it does with the teaching of Jesus himself.
I'm going to agree with you on that. And then I'm going to even point out that in my book, I tried to understand what Jesus's influences were. Yeah. And so part of it is Hebrew, but there's all this other information out there that he was involved with that really wasn't part of his culture.
He was, if you ask me, he studied Taoism and Buddhism substantially.
And Hinduism. Well, Hinduism, I'm going to just say
maybe. It's a little different.
I kind of feel that, well, in the Gospel of John, there's, the Father and I are one. And so that's also like saying the Brahman and the Atman, meaning the big self and the small self, are one. They are one. Right. So we're seeing the same principles here. Yeah. And the other thing about when I really explored Jesus's life and his ministry, I saw a very strong Buddhist element to his ministry. And that was when he said, the more, the less come, the more God works through me. That's a
Hmm.
Buddhist concept because he's recognizing, he doesn't say this, directly, but it's still the same principle. As my ego becomes less and I am actually out doing things that are about compassion and love, I am filled with divine wisdom and
Right.
divine love and divine everything. And so I become less and he becomes more.
Right.
That's
And
Buddhist.
he calls it the kingdom of heaven, but that's
And then
exactly
he
what he's
refers
talking about.
to, and then he refers to the kingdom of heaven. Now,
Mhm.
the thing, what he is up against is that he's taking all these ideas that are, not necessarily part of his culture, and all the people that are in the culture, he's now trying to explain to him different concepts of the divine with their language that they might
Yeah.
understand.
Right.
Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense to them.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I really wish that, I don't know if there is such a thing, but it would be really cool to see, like a Greek, the Gospels in Greek. I'm sure you must be able to get that.
oh yeah,
Um,
you
right?
can.
Like I don't. I mean, he wasn't necessarily speaking Greek. He was probably speaking
Aramaic,
Aramaic.
apparently.
Yeah, which that's going to be a tough one because I don't think that we have any like Aramaic concordance or anything like that. Um, but yeah, there's just so much lost in translation, I think.
I think you pointed it out in your books.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely get into that. Um, okay, so
So I'll
where
just
are we
wrap this
going
up
with
with,
all this?
yeah. So here's the last thing with the Christianity is that I actually made my own pilgrimages to sacred sites.
Oh,
So I ended up in the Vatican. I went through a number of the cathedrals in Europe. I've been to Hagia Sophia, which is in Turkey. So that was all of this was my Christian religious experiences, and it was all because of those visions that I had. And then it went through all of what I just explained, and then it kind of I feel like there was the culmination when I wrote my book.
right.
So I see that there was a beginning and there was an end, and as we talked about before, there was all of this information that was impacted in this, and it directed and focused me into understanding Christianity the way that I did.
Right. So
Uh,
do you feel that like there's some kind of unspeakable, ineffable truth that you have glimpsed little snippets of here and there, and isn't that also true of like is that what Jesus was trying to tell us? Like, is hey guys, there's something kind of weird going on, and like it's not something that we can necessarily understand.
I think that he was experiencing everything.
Yeah.
I think that he was just constantly experiencing something new. And I feel like he probably got to the point where all the old stuff that he grew up with was no longer necessary. And now all this new information that was being filled up with him. So maybe it was
Right.
part of this Holy Spirit kind of thing where he was completely washed and cleansed of this old life. And now this whole new life is being poured through him. And my feeling is that he came to the table knowing who the Father was and knowing a lot of other things. But once he started his ministry, I think other things started to take place. There was on the job learning. So he
Yeah.
didn't learn it all on the job. I think that he brought things to the table. And then after that, there was on the job training and on the job knowledge. And then he got a whole nother dose of information. But I think his many mansions is very important to understand that those are different realities. Where
Okay.
where the Father is, there are many mansions, right? And I
Yeah.
think mansion is his way of saying dimensions.
So those are the three crystal globes that you had in your hand, and there's actually a
Possibly
lot of them.
I think, I mean, that's part of my journey is to understand that what we're seeing is just a small portion of things.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like, well, gee, I understand life as this little lake, and then all of a sudden, somebody takes you to the ocean, you go, holy cow, what's this?
Right.
And then you only know your life as a dinghy, and the next thing you know, you go down to the ocean, and outside, out on the ocean is one of these cargo containers that are 1,200 feet long. All of a sudden, your world doesn't mean anything anymore because
Yeah.
there's another layer of reality that is much bigger than the one that you grew up with.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
see
for
that that's
sure.
kind of like what Jesus, that's part of this journey that I've been on, is that everything is much more diverse, much bigger, much more interesting than our conceptions of it. And if you allow yourself to go out and have them and go out and seek it, you will find it. And I think that's what Jesus was really saying: seek and you shall.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Well, I have one experience that I had. I got to visit Chartres Cathedral, uh, again in
And
the
that's
dead of
in
winter.
France. That's in Paris.
Chartres Cathedral is in Chartres, and it's outside of Paris by about an hour or so.
Oh, okay.
And I got to go to it right before Christmas. So I'm kind of, one of the things that I've been able to do is started to notice that there's a lot of things that happen to me in the dead of winter.
Uh,
So this was another one of those dead of winter things. So my wife and I ended up going to Chartres, and it happened to be a couple of days before uh, Christmas. And we pulled into the town and we parked our car, and here is this amazing cathedral. And one of the parts of this, or one of the things about this particular cathedral, is that when it was built, it was on a pilgrimage road, but then things changed, and so now pilgrimages went somewhere else. They didn't go there. So
oh,
this cathedral pretty much is the way it was when it was built. Other cathedrals got modified based off of what was happening at different times in different eras. And so we go into this door. It's this massive door, and the choir is singing. It's practicing for its service that it's going to be performing on Christmas
cool.
Day. And it was the children's choir. And so what I realized, I mean, I am listening to this music like I had never heard music before. And lo and behold, the cathedral itself, as I now understand it, is an amplifier of energy.
Yeah.
So it's designed to amplify music. It's amplified, sound. And so I'm listening to this choir singing, and I'm now being moved. Okay, the other thing that I didn't realize is that I knew Chartres Cathedral has a labyrinth, a 13-ring labyrinth down the main aisle, the center of not at the crossing center, but down the centers of
Okay.
of of the church. Well, almost every single day out of the year, minus like a couple of 2 or 3 days, there's always chairs filled this aisle.
Right.
But right before Christmas, they take all the chairs away so you can walk the labyrinth. I happen to be
Oh.
there the day that I can walk the labyrinth, so I got to walk that labyrinth. And then I started to walk towards the crossing. And as I was getting towards the crossing, I started to sense that something is about to happen. I know when really strong mystical things are going to happen to me, my body changes. And so I got to the crossing, and I look up, and I'm looking at one of these stained glass windows, and I'm now just having this unbelievable, like, unifying experience, this godlike experience, whatever you want to call it. And all of a sudden, there's a voice in my head that says, there is a mystery. And if you can solve it, there'll be another mystery for you to know. But the first mystery is that you need to understand the connection between Chartres Cathedral, the kings of Israel, and the great pyramids of Egypt. And if you can understand the relationship and the mystery between those three things, then another mystery will be given to you for you to understand.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. And it reminds me of a couple of episodes that I did with Ralph Ellis, who makes a lot of those connections. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say they are the connections, but maybe they are. And he's got a ton of material that he goes through. Like, it's seriously, he's got like 10 or 11 books that are all like 2 inches thick. Like, it's a massive amount of material.
Wow.
So yeah, if you want a very brief introduction to that, go look at some of my I think I have 3 episodes where I talk to Ralph about that stuff.
And his name is Ralph Ellison.
Ralph Ellis.
Ellis.
Yeah.
Is
And
there?
I'll put up a link here.
Okay.
I can just put a link up here. Here it is magically. See? Yeah, it's some fascinating stuff. And he goes into uh, basically mostly it's about kind of this hidden identity of who Jesus is, in terms of like he was actually he figures he was actually a very wealthy king from a nearby state, and he's got all this evidence. It's insane, and it also ties back to Egypt because that is part of Jesus's ancestry, and it goes back to, I believe it was through Cleopatra. Anyway, there's a ton of really fascinating stuff there. It also goes forward into the Arthurian legends
Wow.
and some of the stuff with like the Freemasons and the Templars and stuff like that. So it's this huge, like crazy sounding thing, but it seems like it might actually be legit. And it's very fascinating.
Well, I believe, based off of Jesus's sayings, that he came from a very wealthy family, and they had ties and connections to Egypt.
Mm, okay.
And I can,
Well,
that is that that's not speculative. That's what is in his sayings. So,
yeah, yeah. He's definitely not afraid of money, like a lot of Christians today are. And
he
on the
he
other hand,
embraced
he's
it.
also not in love with money like a lot of other Christians today are.
He
So
understood that he understood the principles of how money works
yeah,
energetically, and
yeah.
he applied that in his ministry.
Yeah. And so I think those same principles apply to money and to health and to happiness and to
Yeah.
wisdom. Like all of this stuff that he was talking about is the same thing that you're talking about now, where it's like there's something that there's a path, there's a way, right? And so when we're getting these spiritual insights in terms of direction, it's allowing us to stay on that way. And Jesus called it the narrow path. He was not necessarily talking about what we think he's talking about the way that we present it in the gospel. I don't think that's what he was talking about. But really, isn't that also what Taoism is? Because literally, it's the way.
And that was what the early Christian movement was called,
Yes.
the way.
Yeah. It also goes back to Egypt because the one of the fundamental principles in ancient Egypt, and that's less on the religious side, and I actually don't think that a lot of the Egyptian stuff is really religious. I think a lot of it is more scientific and geometrical in some way. And one of the ways that that comes through most clearly is with this concept called MAT, MAAT, which if you look it up, if you go to Wikipedia, it'll say that Maat is one of the Egyptians' gods, but it's not really about a god or like a there's a personification or like an anthropomorphization, but really Maat is the underlying principles and it's the ways of wisdom, but it's also where we get our like etymologically, it turned into math and mathematics.
Oh,
So
wow.
we still use Matt. We still worship Matt in a way. We still follow Matt. And it's the only thing that has allowed us to do any of the technological advancements that we have ever achieved is by using math as the underlying principles behind the science that we do.
I want to agree with you and just mention what I've noticed is that the ancient minds were very keen on personifying energy.
Yeah,
So everything was
I'm
personified.
I'm not convinced that it was the ancients who did that. I think that maybe that's a later development where people are trying to understand what the heck the ancient guys wrote down or whatever, and so they're like, um, I think a lot of it is just we can't comprehend what they were thinking, And so we just say, oh, well, they believed in these gods. Well, did they though? Or is that just is that just something that we're projecting backwards through time? Anyway.
I, I think that they, especially when I was reading kind of the hidden gospels, and you're reading material and you're recognizing that they like to personify energy.
Okay.
And so energy, even wisdom was personified as Sophia, right?
Right. Right.
So there are elements within the ancient mind that understood these very big concepts, and so they personified those concepts.
Right. So in doing so, nobody was literally going, "Hey, there's actually a woman named Sophia who lives in the sky."
Right.
Like nobody really thought that.
I think that they just recognize that that's just the way it is. You
It's
know?
just a way of it's a way of telling the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. Um, okay, so we have talked a lot about a lot of interesting things. And one thing that I did want to briefly mention was when we were talking about all the dream stuff, I wanted to bring up I don't know if you've heard of these guys. There's this podcast called This Jungian Life, and it's fascinating. My wife is really into it because she's a counselor and she's really into like the psychology and all that stuff. But they do a ton of work around talking about dreams and dream interpretation, and in really like I think they have like a whole spin-off show that's just about dreams. Um, so that's something that you and our listeners might want to check out, this jungianlife.com. And there was also another guy that I wanted to say something about, but I can't remember his name, so I guess I won't. Um, but where are we? Where are we, David? What's the deal? Is there something you want to summarize or ask a question perhaps?
Well, when I was experiencing some of these things, and I only touched upon just a very small a bit, and part of it was, again, I want to just kind of emphasize that when information came to me, and I'm just going to call it information,
Mm-hmm.
it was always like I had to stop, digest, understand, explore, realize, and be part of whatever that was. And
Mm.
I found that through all of this, it's easy to go, hey, what's the next thing? What about that? What about this? And then just keep chasing, it's like the dog's tail. And
Mm-hmm.
what I found that I wanted to do is that, boy, there's a lot of information out there. And I think what I want to do is just absorb this part
Yeah,
and
yeah.
make it
That's
my
really
own,
key.
and just really make it my own.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, it's like the question is what I learned. And one of the things that the most important thing is that I feel like all of this has been a journey of self-discovery. And it is an apprenticeship. I call it the apprenticeship to consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So the Greeks just said, know thyself.
Right.
And if you can know yourself, as opposed to like all this other stuff, you're going to find that there's a great deal of wisdom already inside of ourselves. It's just a matter of being with it and being comfortable with it.
Yeah.
That's one of them.
Yeah.
I also kind of think that, life in this world is just a grand kind of playground and a kind of a learning center. And the learning center is both for joy and hardship. And then that's part of the union of opposites. It's putting all this stuff together, so.
Yeah. Okay, I think that is actually a very beautiful wrap up, and I'm gonna bullet point a couple of those things that you just said there because I don't know if you noticed, but you laid out a real good process with 5 bullet points, and so I'm gonna pop those up, and
Great.
that'll be the David Collis keys to life.
That's right.
So
And
yeah,
trust the process and trust the
yeah,
process.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, thank you very much, David. This has been a very fascinating and entertaining discussion, as always. And perhaps we shall chat again at some other future point.
Sounds good.
But for now, Thank you for coming, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you, Ken.